Welcome, everybody. Here tonight we have Dr. James Nye. He's a researcher at the University of California, San Diego. He received his BA from Harvard in 91 and his PhD from Cornell University in 97. He completed a NSF NATO postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Würzburg, Germany, and was a Harvard Junior Fellow from 98 to 2000. He does have a new book coming out. It's called The Language of Bees, and that's going to be released in the fall. So today he's going to be talking about his discoveries of the honeybee dance communication, and I'm very excited about it. So with that, Dr. Nye, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carissa. Thank you so much. It is great to be with your group. I see you have 34 people, so that's nice. I wanted to talk to you about part of the work that I've been doing actually has been focusing on other bees, including stingless bees. But today I'm going to talk about the honeybee, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the waggle dance, but I want to expand upon that and really talk about the fact that we discovered that bees can learn how to dance better. But not only that, it's a partnership, not only between the dancers, but also the followers who are getting this information. So the big picture here is, why do animals need to learn? If you think about it, it might be nice, as in many animals, if we didn't really have to learn. So many animals are born knowing their communication system, all the things they need to know for life. We humans are quite different because we need to learn almost everything. So the question is, why is that? What is the problem with not having everything crammed in your brain when you're born? Now, one of the reasons that we need to learn is cultural transmission. And some of you may be old enough to remember this movie. This is from Mad Max. And if you remember the plot, there was a nuclear apocalypse. The parents with their kids took off in a giant 747 and flew around the Earth while the nuclear wars were raging. They landed in Australia. But the parents didn't last much longer after that. And essentially, these kids grew up on their own, making up their own culture and society without any cultural transmission or memory. So I'd like you to reflect on that as we talk about the bees. So this work took place in Yunnan, China, and is with my collaborators with the Ken Tan Lab. And it was really, one of the major studies I've participated in my life, because it ended up being on the cover of Science magazine. And here you see the famous waggle dance with the bees, the followers around it. But part of the story I think is really cool. So this is Dong Shihao, and he grew up in a tiny town on the border of China and Myanmar. And this shown in his family compound with his father and his mother. They lived in an incredibly rural community, as you can see down here, so far away that he actually had to travel miles in order to get to the local village school. So this is one of these stories which is actually true. And he actually had to live there. He only got home on the weekends, even as a child, because it was just so far. He was the first member of his family to college, and now he is a full professor at a fairly prestigious Chinese university in Kunming in Yunnan. And I think this life of hardship actually enabled him to have the perseverance to do what is a very difficult experiment, and that I'm going to tell you about. Well, going back to the big picture, what is the value of cultural learning of communication? Well, first of all, does it just happen in human beings? And the answer is no. So naked mole rats, these cute little critters here, well, maybe a face only a mother could love, but definitely the mother is important because they are the only eusocial mammal. They live in societies dominated by a matriarch, the mom, who does all the reproduction. And it turns out that in her colony, everybody learns a dialect that is similar to hers, and this helps to bind the colony together. Killer whales similarly have a matriarchal society where the sons and daughters hang out with their mothers for prolonged periods of time, and they actually learn the dialect sounds of that mother, and they form these subpods. Humpback whales are famous because males will actually learn a new song, and there are new trends every breeding season. And it turns out the females only like the males, we think, that can sing the latest songs. And so there's actually transmission of these songs, and they catch on like the top 100, at least if you're a humpback whale. We also have corn buntings, and we have ravens, and all of these animals likewise have not only species-specific, but local group-specific transmission of their communication. So I probably don't have to say too much about this, but I always like to introduce this and to say, what is a waggle dance? So here in this image, we have imaginary Karl von Frisch shown here with glasses, and Aristotle in the toga wondering about this. And even 2,000 years ago, Aristotle was very perceptive, and he wrote that when the dancers come back inside the nest, they shake off their load. Although that word, shaking off, aposentai, could actually be translated as they waggle off their load. So he's describing something that we see today, and that therefore causes bees from the same colony to somehow show up at that same flower patch. Well, so that was pretty observant, but it took Karl von Frisch, shown here with his observation colony. Kind of looks like a window frame, and in it he's got two combs. And he's got all these lines here because that was his simple way of measuring the angles of the waggle dance. Okay, and I see that I have a comment here. Yes, I see from Carissa. Thank you very much. Also, I will be pausing at certain points to ask if there are questions. So you can also wait for that if you just want to unmute. So how does this waggle dance actually work? Well, let's show this. Here's a bee. This bee has been painted on a feeder, purple and turquoise, and she's waggling now, and she's waggling again, and she's waggling again. So this is how she communicates the distance and direction of a food source to her nestmates. Well, how does that work? So imagine here you have this colony, sort of this kind of skep, if skeps were made out of adobe, and you have a feeder. This is actually the simple kind of feeder that Karl von Frisch would use, just a dish of sugar water. It's located in the direction of the sun. So when you fly in the direction of the sun to get your food, you simply dance straight up inside the nest. As you guys all know, there are vertical combs in the colony, and so the dancers are dancing on a vertical comb. When they dance straight up means go to the sun. Well, what if the feeder is opposite the direction of the sun? So the logic is you dance straight down. What if the feeder is 90 degrees to the left of the sun, as shown here? Well, in that case, you just dance about 90 degrees to the left. So the dancer is modeling her world in a symbolic way inside the nest. She's saying, I go out, get the food, come back, bring it back to the nest. I go out, get the food, I come back, bring it back to the colony. And she'll do this over and over again throughout the day, as long as the food is rewarding. And as you can see in this image, this is what it looks like with the dancer waggling and the bees following her. Now, I like to show this video from Georgia Tech because I think it really encapsulates everything that you need to know about the waggle
The dance
dance.
exploits two fundamental tools available to the honeybee. First, their ability to see ultraviolet and polarized light allows them to determine the location of the sun at all times. Ultraviolet light is able to penetrate thick clouds or fog. Also, as light from the sun passes through the atmosphere, it's polarized in a direction towards the sun when viewed from the Earth. Devices like polarized film, sunglasses, or honeybee eyes can detect this orientation and determine the position of the sun even while looking in the opposite direction. This gives the bees a type of solar compass, allowing them to always know the precise position of the sun in the sky. A honeybee's entire environment seems to be constantly pointing towards the sun. In addition to this solar compass, bees possess a finely tuned internal clock. This clock is accurate enough for the bees to constantly estimate the new position of the sun as it travels across the sky. In this way, a honeybee can know the current orientation of the sun even after spending many hours within a dark hive. They can even take into account changes in seasons or latitudes. Inside of a dark vertically oriented beehive, The natural shared reference point is gravity, establishing both an up and a down direction. A bee's solar compass and internal clock provides another communal reference point, the sun. By pairing these two global constants, the bees form a simple language. Within the hive, the direction up, away from gravity, substitutes for the location of the sun. Then the angle that the bee dances compared to this up direction is the same angle a bee should fly away from the sun in order to find the target flower. So if the bee dances directly upward, other bees know that they can find flowers by flying directly towards the sun. If a bee dances 90 degrees to the left, then bees leaving the hive should fly 90 degrees to the left of the sun. A bee angling its dance towards the ground will let others know to fly directly away from the sun. As the day goes by, a bee will even use its internal clock to adjust for the movement of the sun in the sky. This lets fellow workers always know the correct direction to travel in order to find food. The central waggle section of the bee's dance also contains information about the distance to a food source. Longer time spent in this part of the dance means that the food is further away. Shorter durations mean that the food is closer by. In general, a bee increases the duration of this section by 1 second for every kilometer of distance to the food. When food is within several meters of the hive, this central section of the dance will shrink, causing a circular dance.
Okay, so I think this is a great moment. And by the way, please do go on YouTube and subscribe to the Georgia Tech College of Computing. You can search for Waggle Dance. Any questions at this moment about how it works? Okay, we can revisit your questions later on. But let's get back to the meat of this talk. Why learn to dance? Well, if you've ever looked in natural combs that are built inside a tree hollow or something like that, you know that they can be incredibly irregular. Here's just an example. And so if you imagine that you are a dancer, you're doing this in the pitch black normally, there's bees crowded all around you, you're doing it vertically, and you're doing it super fast. You're moving 1 body length per second. You have to maintain the correct angle despite all of this, and you have to do it for the correct distance or period of time. So this is challenging, and we thought that maybe one reason why they have to learn how to dance better is if they have to learn how to deal with their hive's particular dance floor, the region where the bees tend to dance. And I actually have the answer to that question, which I'll tell you close to the end. It's the work of one of my current master's students. What the video mentioned, and I think it's definitely worth repeating, is this encoding. Remember it said that about 1 second of the waggle phase per every kilometer. And it turns out that different bee species have different encodings. So you think about this as a plot, that means species 1, let's say it lives in a rainforest, the living is good, it never has to fly more than 1 kilometer. It means that to optimize the time it's spending communicating, it should have this kind of encoding slope. But what about species 2? It lives in a desert environment. It might have to fly 2 to 3 kilometers on average to get food. Then you would predict a slope that is different, that is less steep. So these encodings actually are called dance dialects. And we know that they're different between species on average. But we also know something really interesting. People observed for a long time that even within the same species, even within, for example, Apis mellifera subspecies ligustica, there can be variation. So what's going on here? But you guys also all know that bees can live, honeybees, in a different environment, even the same species. You could have one bee colony near a forest where there's a lot of food. Another bee colony might be in an area which is a kind of food desert for bees and need to forage farther away. So it might be adaptive, even if the same species, Apis mellifera, could somehow adapt its encoding to its local environment. So let's return to that later on. Well, I was talking about Deng Shihao and how he had a lot of tenacity and he had to deal with a lot of hardship. And this is the crazy experiment that he had to do. So you can create single cohort colonies where all the workers are the same age. They still have a queen, but when bees get older, they're foragers. When they're younger, they're nurse bees. So if they're all the same age, there's nobody that can learn from anybody else how to waggle dance. In a normal colony, what you have is you have the younger bees that start being attracted to the older bees, the dancers, when they hit a certain age. And before they even go out and forage, they actually start to follow waggle dances. That's really interesting. Are they learning how to dance by following these potential teachers? Um, so why the students are shown all sleeping here, because that means they had to get up every day before dawn and watch every day until after dusk to see when these bees would first start to be interested and start to move towards the colony entrance, because that means they were interested in foraging. Then they had to gently capture that bee as it was moving out of the entrance, train it to a food source, hope it would fly back inside the nest, and hope it would perform the first waggle dance of its life. So for every one of these bees, we had to watch the first waggle dance of her life. They are painted, and then 21 days later, we saw, when she was a fully mature forager, how those dances looked. And we compared it between a normal colony that had bees of all ages and these single cohort colonies where everyone started out the same age. Well, the first message is that bees without these teachers, without these demonstrators, had greater directional air. And I'll show this to you in a moment, but when you're watching a waggle dance, ideally the bee should be pointed in the same direction every time. But that's not always the case. And when there is greater variation in the direction that she's pointing, she's not providing very accurate directional information. If I told you to go north, but then I said, well, maybe I mean northwest. No, maybe I mean south. Maybe I mean northeast. You would wonder if I was really giving you the accurate direction of all. And that's what you see here. So in these first dances in the experimental bees, they're called naive because they never experienced any dances. There were no older bees for them to learn from. They have wonky dances. They have greater divergence angle errors. They're pointing in all different directions. Now, later in life, they got better. So maybe it's practice, maybe they were able to follow other bees, but somehow they did get better. But their first dances were not very good. Similarly, the first dances of the control bees, these were bees that were able and did follow experienced dancers. They were just the same in their first dances as when they were older. So that means that there was something going on with the greater directional air of these naive bees, their first dances. What does that look like? So let's look at the waggle dance of a control bee that you can see here. And she's pointed down. I'm going to draw arrows to show where she's waggling. And you can see that she is pointed pretty much in the same direction. There's a little bit of variation, but she's doing a good job of pointing in the correct direction of the food. Now, what about these learning deprived bees? Okay, so this direction, this direction, this direction, this direction, this direction, and this direction, and one more. Yeah. Okay, so you can say, well, if I were to eyeball this and draw, sorry, having a bad time drawing with my mouse, it's about the same direction as these control bees, but definitely more spread in the angles. And that's what we mean by angular error. But it's not just the angular error that they got wrong. Remember the video said that they communicate distance by the duration of the waggle run. And here are the waggle run durations. And what you can see here is that for the experimental bees, they were overshooting. This is the normal duration that they should be communicating for Apis mellifera to communicate that distance. The feeder was 150 meters away. But these guys are communicating something that is too far away, and they never recover. They are always overshooting even when they're 21 days older. And this is near about 95% of their lifespan, but as you know, they're not getting worse, they're actually getting better at being foragers the older they get. Another interesting thing is the air. So if you dance too long for one run and then too short for another one, you can look at the error of that, you can look at the variation, and what you'll see is that if there's a lot of variation, you're not communicating distance very accurately. And that's exactly what we see here. These E1 bees have significantly greater variation in the distances they're communicating than the control first dances. These are the bees that grew up with teachers. Different letters, by the way, indicate significant differences. So, to reiterate, here in the green, they are communicating the correct direction, distance encoding for the species. But here in the red, they're overshooting. They're communicating something too great, and they never actually recover. Interesting. They also have higher dance disorder. So if you've ever watched a waggle dance, like in the videos that I just showed, you'll see that bees do a left-right alternation. After the waggle, they might turn left for the return run, but then they waggle again, and the next return run should be turning to the opposite direction. So they should alternate left, right, left, right, left, right, or right, left, right, left, right, left. And you can measure how disordered they are. And what we find is that when they have experienced the following older bees dances, they have low dance disorder. They do the correct left, right, left, right. But if there are no demonstrators, if there are no teachers, they have a lot of dance disorder. In this case, this bee is just going left, 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 left. So she's not doing the correct alternation. And we think that this has meaning for the followers. But I'll talk about that in part 2 of my talk. So how do I show this? Here are normal dances. Okay. And now she's turning right. And now she's turning left. And now she's turning right. And now she's turning left. She's turning right and then left. So a perfectly uniform dance. Well, this is what it looks like when they don't have teachers. So here, she's kind of going around, and she's sort of waggling. There we go. And then now she's turning right. And now she's turning left. But she's not doing a very good job. And she's a little bit all over the place, especially on the dance floor. So here is the graph showing dance disorder, and what you'll see is a higher number means greater disorder. So think of a bee that goes left, 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 left. These first dances of naive bees without demonstrators were the worst. They had higher dance disorder. It did get better when they got older, but the control bees were always good, and these bees had followed dancers for the very first time before they tried to actually dance themselves. So in summary for this part, without social learning, you have directional error increases, distance error increases, they're overshooting the distance they're communicating, dance disorder increases, directional error, by the way, I didn't want to show this graph because I don't overwhelm you with graphs, but it actually correlates with dance disorder. So when you have a wonkier dance in terms of communicating direction, you also have higher dance disorder. And we know that direction and disorder errors decrease with time and experience. So they're getting better. They're potentially learning. Maybe practice makes perfect. But what's really interesting is that distance error is fixed for life. So in humans and in many animals, we have a sensitive stage for learning. So I grew up, my first language was actually Chinese, and because of that, I actually have difficulties pronouncing T's and R's. And if you listen very carefully, you can tell that I have a slight Chinese accent. So I will never be able to get rid of that. Well, possibly with a lot of training and so on, but I'm not going to do that. So it just illustrates that I, as well as bees, might potentially have a sensitive stage. So maybe they are learning the correct distance encoding for their colony early in their life. And wouldn't it be interesting if that distance encoding is learned by the next generation. And as you know, that doesn't last very long. So by the time a bee emerges as an adult, she probably has about 40, 45 days left as an adult, sometimes less. And so the environment can change. The colony might be in the same environment, and it would be useful for them to learn that distance encoding that corresponds to the environment. But, well, what if it gets winter and or towards fall and there's less food? That's actually enough time within a generation or two of workers for the dance encoding system to actually change. And we actually have preliminary evidence that if we provide new bees to this colony that has learned the wrong distance encoding, that is transmitted to the next generation. But stay tuned, we are still working on this paper. So, as I said, why should the distance dialect be culturally transmitted? Because not only do we live, or bees can live in very different environments, but the availability of food, where it's distributed in the environment, can change seasonally. And this is actually key to one of the experiments that we're planning to do in the near future. One interesting thing I wanted to point out is there's actually evidence for this. So in India, in Kulu, this is Kulu here, high in the mountains, in the hills, the food is more spread out. And what you notice here is that this slope, this dark green slope, is a little bit lower, and it is a significant difference than in Bangalore, where the food is more concentrated and easy to get to. And as predicted, the slope is actually significantly higher. So this experiment doesn't tell us everything because they didn't look at the same colonies, but this is the same species in two different environments. So it's possible that they are doing this to match the food availability in their environment. Okay? So I promised you that I would tell you more about what we call the terrain hypothesis. If you look at this, you might think this is the craziest comb you've ever seen, especially as beekeepers. And it's a corrugated comb. We deliberately took foundation, we folded it up like an accordion or like a pleated blind, we stuck it in the colony, and we had them build comb. A lot of this failed because they hated foundation like this, but for the ones that actually succeeded, we tested the bees on it to see could they learn to get better on dancing on this crazy comb. And in fact, they didn't. So science is not always a linear process, but what Brandy did show is something really interesting. First, when the first time they were given this comb, by the way, we just swapped combs, moving it from upstairs in the colony. It's a three-frame observation colony. So it smelled just like their colony. But when they had to dance on this for the first day, they hated it and they refused to, and they would just dance on the wood. But over time they got better and they started to finally dance on the comb. But their dances were no less wonky. They were just as precise when they danced on this comb as 3 days later. So we've eliminated one possibility. They are not learning to dance better on the comb. And this leaves this big one, which again, we are going to try to experiment with. So again, stay tuned and we will tell you more, we hope. Okay, any questions at this point? Because now I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk. Okay, great. I have 2 questions in the chat. Wax comb is an excellent vibration conductor. Do plastic foundations interfere with the quality of the dance? So Jürgen Tautz did some research on this, and he found that bees, a solid plastic foundation that was connected end to end with the wood frame does reduce vibrational transmission. And it seems that bees did not prefer to dance on these solid foundations, but we don't have any evidence that the quality of the dance, meaning the precision of the information provided, was any less in these plastic foundations. And one thing that he did do was he simply cut away the foundation on the sides, so you can have the foundation connected at the top, but slightly away on the other 3 sides, enough for a bee space, and that would allow the vibrations to still transmit. It doesn't seem that vibrations actually are an important part of communication in the waggle dance in terms of through the comb. The bees, the followers, have their antennae positioned right against the body of the dancer. And as she's dancing, as you saw in the video, she's literally whacking them with her body against the antenna. And we think that that provides the followers with the information, but it probably also provides the followers with the dancer with information that she's being followed. Okay. Great. So one new. Are experienced dancers better at recruiting and teaching new dancers? Do the new dancers know who the best teachers are? That is a really great question. And we don't really know, but in the colony that in which had newbies that were following the experienced dancers before they themselves first danced, their dances were just as good the first time they did it as the dances of the experienced dancers. So they did just as good a job as those experienced teachers. And we think, therefore, that they're probably all as good in the colony as long as you've had teachers. Do the foragers show wonky dances after have more trouble finding the food? Okay, so do the followers. They probably do, but unfortunately, it's hard for us to figure that out because it's hard for us to radar track the bees. There is that technology available, but it's pretty tricky. There is a new study that just came out where you have drones for folks who have fun with drones, and they've developed a way to follow bees with drones. So that might be a way that we could figure this out in the future. If the food is very near the hive, they actually produce the round dance, not the waggle dance. And in the round dance, there is a little bit of information about distance and direction, but very little. And so we think that when the food is less than 50 meters away, they can just easily find it. After all, bees normally can forage over kilometers. Okay, thank you for those questions. I am going to move on to the next part of my talk, and then we can answer questions at the end. I think that was it for the questions for now. So I alluded to the fact that the dancer might be attending to the audience. And that's true of human speakers as well, or human performers. And this is the next set of experiments that I want to talk about. So here's a typical observation colony. You may have seen one at a fair, or maybe some of you even have one. It is a two-frame observation colony, and we have an iron fence that you're going to see in a video. The bees can climb over the iron fence. This is open, so we can easily monitor what the bees are doing, but they tend not to. So if we remove half of the bees on this dance floor, then about half of it remains removed. And this is how we remove the bees. So we have an aspirator. It's basically a vacuum. And what we do is we place the vacuum and we gently vacuum up the bees. Now, some of you have probably worked with bee vacs. This is a much gentler system, and through multiple control experiments, we found that it was not disturbing the other bees left on the dance floor, and it was not disturbing the dancers, but it enabled us to control the size of the dance floor, the population on it. So here, I want to show you the baseline where we have a large audience, and I want you to watch the orange dancer. Okay, so here she is. She's dancing. And she's pointing pretty much the same direction each time. She's doing a pretty good job. Now, we've removed, this is about 15 minutes later, half of the bees on the dance floor. Same colony, same dancer. And let's look at what happens to her dance. Sorry. Okay, you can ignore the line, it was vertical, I made a mistake. But as you can see, it is wonkier, just like the bees that never had teachers. But these bees have teachers, and these are actually older bees that are experienced foragers. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that when there's a smaller audience, there is lower waggle dance precision. So if we think just about more precise is down here and less precise is up here, when we have a high audience, there is greater precision. When a medium audience, the precision starts to get lower. And when we have a low audience, the precision is the worse. Remember, higher is less precise. Now this is for direction. We can also measure distance. And remember, distance is measured by the duration of the waggle run, and the precision is measured by looking at the variation in it. But again, you see the same trend. When there is a high audience, those bees are more precise. But as the audience goes down, they are getting less precise. So something about the audience is changing the precision of the dancers. Why would that be? Why are there more airs when the audience is small? And so in this cartoon, we want to kind of show our hypothesis that we think it has to do with bees that are seeking an audience. And here, we'll show this video in a moment, but we actually see the audience-seeking behavior of a bee that has a high audience. She tends to stay clustered, this is her actual path, versus a low audience, where she's traveling all over the place. Is she doing this traveling all over the comb, which remember has very few bees on it, to actually try to get some bees to follow her? So this is the trajectory with a large audience. And one nice thing about this video, this is the work of Tao Lin, one of our collaborators in China, is that you can see that she's largely staying in the same place. Oh, by the way, the thicker line is more recent, as the older lines are thinner, and so they fade away. Okay, but she's largely staying in the same place. Now, what about with a small audience? Here you can see that she's wandering. She does have a few followers, but she's actually traveling around almost as if she's trying to seek out more followers. And this is typical of what we see when there is a small audience. So what is going on here? We think that the bee has to compromise two things. Remember I talked about how hard it is to dance inside the nest, right? It's dark, it's crowded. Well, not in this case, but normally it is. And you have to be precise. But what if at the same time you need to seek bees to follow you? After all, if you dance and there's nobody there to listen, it doesn't make any difference to the colony and you're just wasting your time. So here what we think is that the bee is compromised in terms of her movements. She wants to be precise, we think, but at the same time she wants to find and keep an audience. And so because of that, she's not able to be as precise. Imagine if you're trying to do very precise movements, but you're also distracted because you're trying to find an audience to listen to your signals. Now, the first question you might ask is, well, is it that she's looking for bees to follow her, or is she just measuring the total number of bees on the dance floor? Because maybe she could look at this and say, well, I can smell that there aren't many bees here, so I'm going to have to seek an audience. And so here's an interesting trick that Tao Lin and our collaborators did. So older bees pay attention, so here are the graybeards, because the older bees are dancers and foragers. So here's the large adult audience, and apologize for the quality of the video. This is the best that we have. And what you can see is she's largely going in the same direction. Now, it turns out that very young bees that are less than 3 days old, and I've kind of represented these as punk rock bees because they're not into this old style dancing or cabaret, and they ignore dancers. So here in this video, what you'll see is these bees that have blue on their backs. These bees were all newly emerged from a comb in an incubator, and they were marked and placed in, and they're all less than 3 days old. Now let's watch this orange bee. So she's unloading her food. And now she is going around and she is going to try to dance. So you can see that she is trying her hardest to attract attention. But although she does a few waggle-like movements, apart from this one bee who's an older bee that is following her, none of the younger bees are paying attention. So, we have a situation, same number of bees on the dance floor, but In this case, nobody's paying attention. What happens? Well, it turns out that when they don't have bees that pay attention, sorry, I'll go back here, they again have these wonky dances. So it's not that they need to know the number of bees on the dance floor. What they need to know is the number of bees that are actually attending to their dance, which we think has to do with the number of antenna. Remember, the dancers whacking the antenna of the followers with their body, but equally the antenna of the followers are hitting the dancer's body. And we think that that is likely how she is understanding the size of her audience. But one thing that I wanted to get at, which is really interesting, is what we call the anticipated audience. So imagine that you've had a really hard time. You're a street musician and you've worked your butt off to try to get an audience there to listen to you. But because it's been so hard to get anybody to stay still and listen to your performance, you might be a little bit worried. And as a bee, you should be, because dancers often lose followers. So it turns out that in these cases, we're comparing a condition where there's a medium-sized audience with a high audience. But in these cases, these dancers have the same average number of followers. Because remember, you can get lucky. If you don't have many bees on the dance floor, you might get lucky and attract attention. If you have a lot of bees on a dance floor, you might get unlucky and not get very much attention. So these bees have the same average number of followers. But look at this. When they've had greater difficulty attracting an audience, they have greater error. They have greater variation in their communication direction. Same thing, sorry, distance in this case. Same thing with direction. So what we see here is that it's not only the number of bees, it's actually not at all the number of bees that are on the dance floor. They don't care about that. They care about the number of followers they have. But if they've had greater difficulty in getting those followers, they need to attract more followers, and that's why we think that the error rate goes up. Okay, so the conclusions for this part of it is that waggle dancing is genetically encoded. We've seen that overall because even the bees that did not get to follow a waggle dance for the first time in their life, they were able to dance fairly well. But they had some error, and therefore they can benefit from social learning. They can be better if for the first time in their life, before they danced, they were able to follow experienced dancers. But why do they need to learn? After all, they already know how to waggle dance, right? We know it's not dancing on a regular dance floors. That's ruled out by Brandy's experiment. But we have this other experiment that we need to do. Are they tuning the dance to adapt locally? And so this is an exciting thing that we're applying for grant money to run. And, excuse me, we hope we can finally test this hypothesis. So the other part is that dancing is a two-way street. And I think that most biologists didn't think about it that way. They thought about, okay, here's the dancer. She's got all the information. She's going to tell everybody what to do. But she's depending upon having an audience, because if she doesn't, what she's dancing and doing is not going to make any difference. So in seeking an audience, we believe that that leads to errors in the dance. And she also seems to be dancing for a potential audience. If she's had trouble, she's a little bit insecure in a way, and she's looking for other followers, trying to gather them in because her goal is to communicate. Now, what's really interesting is that this suggests intentionality in dancing. If I, as a human being, say, okay, I'm going to give this talk, and I'm watching everybody in the audience to see if they get it, I am intending that the audience understand this. And there are certain examples of this kind of intentionality in great apes, like chimpanzees, but wouldn't it be cool if we could show that bees also have intentionality? Just something that I'm throwing out there, something that I think is very interesting. Okay, so I wanted to thank all of the different researchers. So Dong Shihao did experiment 1, where we're showing that bees need teachers, social learning. Tao Lin, who did the work which is actually now going to be published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. That's very exciting, and we hope that'll be a big boost for his career, looking at the effect of the audience. Ken Tan is the senior member of the lab who was the advisor for Dong and Tao. And of course, I wanted to thank the bees and the funding sources that made these experiments possible. And before getting to questions, I guess I will pitch my book. This QR code, if you want to scan it, you can take a look. But the easiest thing to do, honestly, is to go to Amazon and just type in my name, James Nieh, or the language of bees, and this will come out. It's on pre-order. This is the price for a hardcover book. And yeah, please take a look if you're interested in learning more about bee communication. This book is pitched for a general audience. I really wanted to tell the story of how I started to study bees, what fascinated me about it, and how I looked at many different kinds of bees, honeybees, bumblebees, stingless bees, going from Panama to Brazil and now to China. So, okay, well, I will go ahead and answer questions. So let
Yeah,
me.
it does look like we have a few in the chat. Eric is asking, is the seeking of an audience about seeking physical contact?
Great question. So it probably is about physical contact. We know that older bees smell a little bit differently from younger bees. So they might be able to move around and smell that there are older bees around. But still, remember there was that kind of insecurity when they had a hard time getting bees. So I don't necessarily think they're smelling the size of their actual dance followers. I think that they are actually being contacted by the antenna of the followers, or somehow sensing that there are bees that are attending to their movements. The other thing I wanted to point out is you saw that bees sometimes gave samples to other bees. It's called trophallaxis, and they exchange food. We looked at the number of trophallactic contacts, and they were not correlated with this dance precision. So it's not trophallaxis, the giving of food samples, it's actually being followed.
And Lance is asking, is the dance floor predominantly over the brood frames, or do they dance over frames full of honey also? Would other foragers be found more frequently in different areas of the hive?
So in these observation colonies, and that's a great question, we've set it up so that there's one entrance and the bees dance near the entrance where the foragers come in and where they leave to go out and get food. That's very logical. And that could be brood, it could be honey. But in the ways that beekeepers have their colonies, let's say you've got a honey super and then you've got brood on the bottom, it probably would likely be brood. The one thing that we don't know is, let's say you have a colony that doesn't have a closed down entrance. The bees could dance on any of those 8 or 10 combs, and we don't know how they decide. But I do think that there has to be a mutual agreement that this is where the foragers are going to be, meaning this is where the dancers are going to go, because that's where they need followers. And so I think that would be a really interesting experiment to design a camera that could kind of look at an angle to see what's going on inside the colony. I did meet a beekeeper who's an inventor who's actually working on something like that. So I think that'd be super cool.
Yeah. And Sherry's asking, might the younger bees ignore the dancing as it's only for the forager bees?
So the younger bees are not interested in dancers, correct? They are the nurse bees, and so it's only later in their life. It can be as early as 9 to 12 days when they start getting interested in the foragers. But what's interesting is 9 to 12 days, they're usually not going to be go out and foraging, so it's well before they actually start foraging and even dancing, but they somehow start getting interested in those dances.
And George asks, it's funny because as I'm reading this, I've been thinking during your talk, Dr. Nye, it's like I wonder how much or how many behaviors that this concept could apply to, or how many instinctual or programmatic, they're programmed to do certain things, and it's like, yeah, how broadly this could be applied or studied anyway. So George is asking, are there other behaviors besides foraging that are socially learned, such as defensiveness?
That's really interesting. So, in honeybees, the waggle dance is definitely the most complex kind of behavior from a motor perspective and what they have to do. Um, There is work on honey robbing by Claire Ritchoff at the University of Kentucky. And what she found, and I'm sure you've seen this in your apiaries, especially towards fall, is there's kind of a syndrome that starts, and everybody starts to rob, partly because there's no other natural food. But this kind of robbiness tends to spread. And what's interesting is that the robbers, you would think that they would get a warm welcome when they come back in the colony. After all, they've got all this honey. But in fact, they are treated very aggressively by the guard bees of their own colony. They are allowed to come back, but in that robbing, something has changed. Their brain has changed. The mitochondria, the energy source of all life, has changed towards a more aggressive mitochondrial profile. And these bees are actually more aggressive. So it's almost like they've gone out, they've had to fight to get this food, they come back, and they're still in the Rambo mode. They're still very aggressive, and it looks like that their guards respond to that. So talking about kind of a cultural shift, it seems like these colonies shift towards being more aggressive. It doesn't mean they stop robbing, but if you think about it adaptively, given that it's the season of robbing, it's quite likely that somebody's going to try to rob you as well. So maybe it's good that your guards are going to be more defensive. That's that's the thing that I can think about in terms of changing behavior. Although, of course, that's not necessarily communication.
Hmm. And Roger has an interesting question. Does this mean when making a split and not getting enough, making a split and not getting enough older foragers to pass on dance accuracy, that they may have trouble locating food sources?
That's a great question. I got that from another group that I was just talking to. And the answer is I don't think so. This was a very extreme situation. Everybody, all 2,000 bees were the same age, apart from the queen, who was older, of course. But, we really had to reduce that variation. Any kind of split that you would do, you would still randomly get some older bees there. And so I think that that would really not be a problem.
Hmm. That's good.
Any other questions?
Oh, we got one more coming in. When the foragers return with resources, do they dance to attract other bees to help them unload their resources?
Interesting. So when a bee comes in with food, she first, with nectar or water, she unloads that herself. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let me repeat that. Nectar or water, she relies on other bees to unload that food for her. So she never unloads her own nectar or dilute nectar. When she comes in with pollen, she does eventually unload that and stuff it into a pollen cell. But what's interesting is pollen dancers always keep the pollen on their corbicula, on their bee baskets while they're dancing. And that pollen is whacking the other bees in the antenna as well. And the antennae are how bees smell. So it's very clear to a bee who is a pollen dancer versus who is not. Now, in terms of the nectar dancers, nectar foragers, they will only dance if the colony wanted their food. So if you come back with very dilute, watery nectar, chances are the colony doesn't want that usually. And so they are not going to unload you very rapidly. You offer the food, nobody wants it, and you get discouraged and you basically don't dance. In fact, you do something called a tremble dance instead. But if you come in with very sweet stuff, and the colony is clustering around you, 3 to 4 bees simultaneously trying to suck it from your proboscis, then you unload your food in a very short period of time, and then you start to dance. And in fact, the faster you're unloaded, the more motivated you are to dance, and the longer you'll dance.
One more came in. I wonder if bees are like airplanes. They are all essentially flying in the same path. Does that help them get to where they are going?
So they are foraging in many different locations at the same time to get food. And you can actually look at this in any colony because at any moment in time, if they're only going to one location, all the dances will be pointing in the same direction. But if you look at a comb, they are actually dancing in all different directions. And even within an observation hive, if you can look through and carefully lift up the comb that has the dancers, and you can often see this, especially on a nice warm day, you won't disturb them, and you'll see they're dancing usually in many different directions. What's interesting is Tim Landgraf and his group recently published a paper. So if all the bees, let's say you're group A and you found something in the west, and group B has found something in the east, if you think about it, they're all going to be dancing in the same direction. But what that means is there's going to be a spatial segregation, and Team A is going to end up on one section of the comb, and Team B is going to end up on a different section of the comb. So there is going to be spatial segregation of dancers in the colony, and that will actually show up. But going back to your question, they are moving in all different directions at the same time.
So
Okay.
these tremble dancing bees with watery nectar that nobody wants, do they just keep trembling until they give up?
So they do. I should mention the water. So bees do need a little bit of water, but they don't often recruit for it. The only case, and this was discovered by Lindauer in a super cool experiment, is he heated the colony. On a hot day in the summer, you may notice bees evaporating water. It kind of looks like when they're honey ripening. And what they're doing is like a swamp cooler. They're evaporating the water and it cools the colony down. This is basically the only time in a colony where if you bring home water, that everybody loves you. Because now people want the water because they need to cool down the colony. So for the first time, you start waggle dancing for water sources, and the colony switches from collecting nectar to collecting water so they can cool the colony down.
So Lance wants to know, does the number of dance repetitions denote food source quality?
It does, yes. There are two
Okay.
measures of food quality, how rapidly they do the return phase. If they do a fast, short return phase, because they're not seeking an audience and they're excited, that means the food is better, and if they repeat it. But the repetitions are the most important. Sometimes they can dance for hundreds of waggle rounds. We had one that did 250, which is kind of crazy
Oh,
for a dog.
wow.
Yeah, she was there for half an hour.
Oh my God. Wow. Okay. Very determined bee.
Hmm.
That is all she wrote. Thank you so much, Dr. Nye. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Krista. Great talking to your group.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you again.
All right, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.